It was around 9 in the morning when a rookie prison officer stood outside a cell located in an administrative segregation wing at a Texas prison. He was there to take a prisoner to another unit, but when the inmate got outside of the cell, he somehow slipped out of his handcuffs. In the flash of an eye, the prisoner was beating the officer over the head with a metal bar. The victim's colleagues not long after viewed CCTV footage that showed the inmate throwing the officer's limp body down a staircase. The officer, with less than a year on the job, left 2 children behind. The man behind the attack later said to prison staff, "They didn't know how dangerous I am." That's a true story, something that took place in 2015. It's a brutal story, but if you've been a prison officer long enough, it's not something all that out of the ordinary. Here are some of the most terrifying tales from those people tasked with trying to keep order in some of the most dangerous places in the world. Number 10. The worst thing he'd ever seen. This story was told by a retired prison guard. He said that he'd seen everything in the prisons he'd worked in. People who'd been stabbed to death, people who'd hanged themselves with bed sheets, all matter of carnage. But only one time did something make him go into shock. One day he was asked to take a prisoner to see the doctor. When they arrived at medical, the guy was asked to pull up his pants. Both his legs were bandaged. When he removed the bandages, what the officer described seeing was rotted, abscessed flesh. Turns out the inmate had been shooting up heroin for quite some time, and he hadn't taken care of the infections in his legs. The doctor tried to bend one of the inmate's legs, and it oozed pus all over the place. The doctor then asked the officer to leave the room. When the officer asked why, the doctor replied, "You're going into shock. I need you to leave before you pass out." As you'll see, it's not that uncommon for officers to see things that turn their faces white as a sheet. Number 9. Extreme fights. This one is short and involves a fight. You all know fights break out in prison quite a lot, so we won't include too many regular scrapping stories. However, just to give you an idea of how extreme violence can get, here's what one prison officer once saw. One man approached another man and stuck a shank in his ear. The blade broke off, so what did the man do? He stomped on the shank. According to the officer, the blade came out the victim's mouth, and he survived. If you think that's bad, listen to how a fight changed one man's face forever. Number 8. Taking it on the chin. One day an officer got a call that there was a fight in the shower. When he arrived at the scene, one inmate had pushed another inmate over a bench in the shower room, jumped on the guy, and then somehow during the tangle, he'd bitten off the guy's chin. The officer, no stranger to violence, was the person responsible for scooping up the bit of chin flesh that was on the floor. If things weren't hectic enough, on the way to the hospital, the ambulance hit a deer. The officer who was in the car behind also hit that unfortunate animal. Maybe inmates don't receive the best medical treatment because the officer said that the doctor seemed to just slap the bit of lost chin right onto the man's face. Lo and behold, in not much time, the wound became gangrenous and the guy almost died from the infection. His chin was never the same after that. The next incredible obscene story will make you think about how sanity can so easily be lost in the isolation cell. Number 7. The birthday boy. An officer was working in the segregation unit when he looked through one of the doors. What he saw was an inmate sitting on the floor with his legs around the toilet basin. At the same time, the man had his hands in the toilet and looked as if he was chewing on something. The officer, thinking this didn't look good, said he opened the food slot in the door. When he did that, he was hit with the most repugnant odor. This guy was eating his own excrement. He called another officers for some help, and both of them tried to talk the man out of eating his own poop. The guy then told the officers that he couldn't finish all of his birthday cake, and did they want some? Obviously, a lot of time in solitary had driven the guy crazy. Our next story proves that being a prison corrections officer means you have to have a strong stomach and a willingness to get very, very dirty. Number 6. The Devil's Bag. This next story comes from an officer who worked at LA's infamous Twin Towers Correctional Facility. He said this place is well known for the number of mentally ill inmates it's home to, so it wasn't so uncommon for the guy to get home from work and after his wife asked him about his day, he'd say, another guy removed his own testicles. With that in mind, what was a really bad day for this officer? He'd been called to this inmate's cell only to see through the door that the guy had covered himself in his own poop. This can happen at times, since inmates want the officer's job to be hard when they just try to take them down to the floor. But then the inmate grabbed more poop and just started packing his mouth with it. According to the officer, the prisoner was trying to suffocate himself with poop. Somehow, the prisoner then got a hold of a plastic bag, something he shouldn't have had in his cell. He put the bag around his poop-filled face and tried to suffocate himself some more. That's when the officers got in the cell and pounced on him. In the officer's own words, "I ruined my uniform that day." When the inmate was fully restrained, the inmate just grinned, as if looking off into the distance. The officer said, "I can't really convey how how creepy it was, but you get my point. He wouldn't respond to any of our questions, didn't cry, didn't say a thing. The officer eventually got through to the guy and asked him where did he manage to find the plastic bag. The inmate looked at him with a grin still on his face and said, "The devil gave it to me." The next story is not for anyone squeamish at the sight of blood. Number 5. The bloody escape artist. The next story was told by a former British prison officer named Neil Samworth. He'd been featured in quite a few podcasts and has talked openly about some of the horrendous things he saw on the job. He said that day to day you might see sad and shocking things in a prison, but he also said you have your 1%ers. These are the guys that can still shock officers who've grown a very thick skin. One such inmate had only been given a short sentence, but was lengthened after a few escape attempts. One day, this guy managed to get a gun sneaked into the prison hospital where he was housed, and that time his escape was successful. His freedom didn't last for long though, and he was eventually sent to Strangeways prison where Samworth worked. Because of his ability to escape, he turned up at Strangeways connected to a body belt, but he managed to slip even out of that. Samworth said this guy had to be watched the entire time because he was a chronic self-harmer. He said the inmate was always respectful and polite, but he hated it when the light in his cell was turned on. One night he asked for it to be turned off, and Samworth asked his superior if he could do that. She said no. It's worth mentioning here that Samworth had been critical at times of prisons and prison officers. The inmate proceeded to rip out all the light fittings, after which all the lights in the other cells turned off because they were all connected. The inmate then slid some of the fittings under the door just to show it to the officers. He soon taught other inmates how to take out the lights. Apparently it took some skill and effort, but the inmate didn't stop there. He may not have had the tools to self-harm, but using his own sharpened fingernails, he could create so much blood that it filled the floor of the cell. He did this so much a kind of skin covered the floor. The prison governor then decided the only thing for him was a special cell in the segregation unit. But in that cell he managed to break through a wall and again pull out electrical wires. He then cut himself deeply and filled the cell with his own blood. There was so much blood loss, he fainted. Our next story is very eye-popping, literally. Number 4. An eye for an eye. A prison officer told a story about two cellmates whom he said were usually on good terms and never caused anyone any trouble. For the most part, they were quiet and respectful. Then one night the officer heard screaming coming from that cell. He went to investigate and saw one of the inmates lying calmly on his bed with his eyes closed. The other guy was making the most awful noises. In one of his hands was his own eyeball still dangling from the optic nerve and surrounded by what looked like a foamy substance. After the guy was sent to the hospital, the officers asked the other inmate what had happened. He told them matter-of-factly that his cellmate had been bothering him while he was trying to sleep. For that, he'd gotten the inmate down and scooped out his eyeball with a spoon. He said he just wanted some peace and quiet. I hope you aren't getting squeamish on us because our next story has plenty of gore. Number 3. Blood and guts. One officer said he had an inmate that had gone to the hospital to have some surgery on his stomach. The inmate spent a few days in the hospital bed and then was released. One day when he was in his cell, the officer walked past the door only to see something strange. The inmate was sitting on the floor with his back to the door, his arms doing something in front of him and his legs stretched out. The officer decided that this didn't look right, especially when the inmate didn't respond to questions. The prisoner had never done anything harmful to himself in the past, but something was amiss on this day. When the officer said again, "What are you doing?" the inmate said, "Go away." This is what the officer said happened next. I had the door opened by the control center, and when the door opened, it let in enough light into the cell for me to see a bloody handprint on the floor next to him. He ordered the inmate to stand up so he could be handcuffed. This usually quiet prisoner did as he was told, except when he put his hands behind him, they were covered in blood. The officer then got on the radio and asked for some backup. What had happened is the inmate had taken out his stitches, but now since there was easy access, he decided to go inside and start pulling out bits of his guts. Why? The inmate said he wanted to play with them. This is what the officer said about that day. "I've responded to stabbings, rapes, beatings, large-scale gang fights. I've had to forcefully lock down entire pods who were non-compliant with directives to lock down. And even with all of those experiences, the guts guy, as my co-workers and I now call him, definitely stands out." Our next prison horror story proves that if you like your eyes safely inside your skull, maybe do your best to stay out of prison. Number 2. The Pirate. This story comes from a juvenile prison in the US. According to a web forum, an officer said that two young offenders were housed in the same cell, except one of the kids was well known for being violent and the other kid was not aggressive at all. One day the violent kid decided he was going to extract a screw from a bench and hide it. During the night, he pulled out the screw and went over to where the other guy was sleeping. He got on top of him and screamed out loud, "I'm gonna make you a pirate." He proceeded to push the screw into the other guy's eye. When the first responder got to the cell, he asked why the inmate had done such a thing. The kid replied, "He looked at me the wrong way." Don't worry, our last prison horror story doesn't involve things getting shoved into people's eyes. Instead, it includes something being shoved somewhere much more sensitive. Number 1. Inmate G. The officer telling this story said he worked at a prison in Tennessee. He'd usually work on the medium security wings, which he enjoyed, but from time to time, because of staff shortages, he was asked to work at the Ultramax unit. He said he dreaded those days because many of the inmates had serious mental issues. One of those inmates he named Inmate G. This guy was what you might call hard to control, and from the sounds of it, mentally unwell. One day, the officer was delivering food to each cell through the food slots, and Inmate G was shouting and screaming because it was taking too long. In fact, he was so upset he made something called a stinger. Despite what some of our viewers think, us guys at the Infographics Show have not done hard time. So we'll let the officer describe in his own words what a stinger is. A paperclip or even a notebook wire folded over to plug into the socket and have one end stick out to get hot and light paper on fire. The Ultramax unit is set up so if anything is plugged into an outlet, that cell's power gets tripped. The officer then wrote up a disciplinary report, but because of what was going down, the entire wing was screaming and shouting. It was chaos. Inmate G kept on shouting, so the officer called for some backup. As the officer was waiting for help to arrive, Inmate G looked at him through the door. He took out a pen and pulled out the wire spring. He then started cutting himself on the wrist and around the throat with the wire, at which point the officer got on the radio and asked for responders and medical staff to come. Blood was everywhere, but Inmate G didn't stop there. He stripped off his clothes, and for the next 2 minutes he pushed that wire into his urethra. The officer later said about this, "We finally got him out of the cell and had to send him to the special needs medical prison down the road." That was almost an every week thing with him. Now, you need to watch Why No One Has Ever Escaped Devil's Island Prison, or have a look at what happens in the H unit at Federal Supermax Prison.